The NBA draft is 2 weeks from today. The Phoenix Suns don't have a pick as it stands, but they could get one. Damon Allred is here of Bright Side of the Sun to break down all the options available. And of course, we're getting into the COVID nightmare that overtook the Suns on Wednesday. Do not miss it. Locked on Suns. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 5 seasons and a writer at Suns.com and Dime Magazine. Thanks for making Locked On Suns your first listen today and every day. As I keep promising you guys, the news is not slowing down, and we got more of it today. So wherever you're finding us, hit subscribe, hit follow on your favorite podcast platform. And if you are watching on YouTube, hit subscribe there as well down below. And drop me a comment. Let me know what you think, what you make of this Suns COVID news. Damon Allred is here. He is a writer at Bright Side of the Sun and Zona Hoops. He's going to help us get into some draft stuff. That's the reason we initially brought you on, Damon. But the Suns provided us with a little bit of extra to talk about. I feel like this happens when I have you on often, where we're like, okay, great, we're going to talk about this, and then something drops and we have to talk about it. But how are you? How are you handling the offseason? Are you getting more sleep? Because that's been the highlight for me.
I am getting no sleep whatsoever. I am completely focused on the draft. And you kind of blindside a little bit in that intro saying it's just 2 weeks away. It feels like it's still so far out. I got to kick my butt into gear and get some content out.
Damon is going to be sending each of you handmade, homemade draft profiles of each player. I'm signing up for it now. He's going to... let's see, what can we do? He'll be taking over this feed to go live on YouTube throughout the entirety of the draft. No, but it is a lot. I don't envy you trying to keep up with all this stuff because I took complete advantage of the fact that the Suns don't have a pick and said, fantastic, I don't have to pay attention. That's why I brought you on. But we'll get into all of that later in the show. We have to start with the COVID outbreak. I don't know what to call it. Let's get into the details, though. So this is from The Athletic. Sam Amick and Joe Vardon reporting from Boston, which was a funny, whatever it's called, capitalized word where the city is that the thing happened. I am a journalist, but I don't know the word for that. Where they said that the Suns reportedly had
I
6
forgot the
people,
word too.
including, I will. It'll come to me. 6 people, including 1 player, test positive at some point during the second round. The player tested positive after Game 7. I'll read the important parts. So this is a direct quote from the Athletic story. The ordeal raised questions internally about whether they were following the league's rules for testing. The NBA requires all team personnel, regardless of vaccine status, to test for the virus if they are experiencing symptoms, and they may not play, coach, or be at team facilities if they test positive. The Suns, who privately insists there was no breach of protocol, declined to comment publicly for this story. The story then quotes somebody with knowledge of the Suns' positive tests, said, I think it's very clear that nobody wanted to report stuff, and that's where it gets dicey. A league spokesman told The Athletic the NBA has seen no evidence to suggest any rules violations by Suns players or staff. They could revisit if new information emerged. And then this is the interesting part here. The Mavericks had grown concerned about the rumblings, too, with one Dallas source indicating the discussion about a rumored Suns outbreak began as early as Game 5. So, Damon, you are as... for better or worse, often worse, plugged in as much as I am to Suns Twitter. This completely took over everybody's feeds and chatter and everything online all day today here on Wednesday. What was your reaction when you saw this news come out?
So I had actually initially just started to write up a little report about it for Bright Side of the Sun before I saw Dave King cover it instead. But in the write-up that I was working on, I kind of mentioned that, you know, the only way to describe this, if they did follow all the protocols correctly and all that. The only way to describe it is that it's just heartbreakingly unfortunate, and that there's not really much more you can say about it than that. Like, I guess it's a little bit of an explanation. Maybe they didn't really expect to be playing much further if they did beat the Mavericks, with guys probably being out for COVID.
I thought the same thing. I'm like, this was a short-term plan for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And it really just broke the team. And you could tell by Game 6 and Game 7 that they just mentally weren't there.
Yeah, I think it was, if you're kind of building like the Lincoln Log fort of all the stuff that eventually broke down, I guess you built it up and then it got, I don't know where the metaphor is going, but this was one component of it, right? Like, this was one thing that you could point to and say it would at least explain the mindset, the bizarre sort of public statements, like the weirdness, right? We've all sort of been looking for some pieces of answers. We've heard these people weren't getting along. We've now heard this group was worried about COVID. Like, it's another piece of that. To me, though, do you buy that they were following the protocols? Like, I don't think I do.
I mean, yeah, all the quotes in the story you can kind of get behind, just like the one from the outside source saying no one wanted to report anything, you could buy that. The league spokesman saying we can't find any evidence that they tried to hide this, you could buy that too. It's really just so many different moving parts.
Yeah, I mean, the NBA not having evidence to me is not a surprise at all, because what would the evidence be? The only evidence that would indicate that there was any malpractice or like hiding of anything would be that if the league somehow was absolutely positive that somebody had a cough or a sniffle, right? Like, there's no way other than that to know what was going on. I mean, like, the only problem, because the NBA's rules are so vague, is that a player might have had symptoms but chosen not to be tested. That would really be the only thing that would be a rule break here. And there's no way to know that. Only the people in the Suns building would have had any way of knowing that. Which brings me to the point that I think is the important one here. NBA cases basically disappeared after Paul George in the play-in. And even that one really was surprising, because it had been a while since a prominent player had tested positive, even up to that point. Come to find out, actually, in this same story, Paul George seemed to have a pretty severe case of COVID. He probably had no choice but to get a test. The NBA and like pro sports, to me, that's the problem here. Like, the NFL also, another part of this that I don't think is really getting a lot of consideration while people are talking about the Suns story today, is the NFL, like, we all joked all year about, oh, well, what if Aaron Rodgers and his decision, and it ends up you get to the day before a playoff game and Aaron Rodgers tests positive, that'll be such a big joke. Well, what actually happened is nobody in the entire league tested positive the whole time that the NFL postseason was going on. That's not a coincidence. The leagues, to me, made a conscious decision. We are not going to test for this stuff because we don't want it to hurt our product. So when you rely on self-reporting and things like that, it becomes a matter of who can keep it more secretive, who can kind of stick it out. And when everybody involved is incredibly competitive, we all know where that's going to lead, right? I mean, you're telling immensely competitive people that as long as they don't make a scene out of being sick, they're good. We all knew where this was going to go, and I don't think the Suns were probably the only team that dealt with this.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're going to see in the coming months, as both leagues really are in their off seasons, that I think they're both going to, have much relaxed protocols for the next season, just in terms of, like, if you have someone who has symptoms, keep them away from the team. But other than that, they'll probably push forward a lot more than they did in each of their past years.
Yeah, I don't even, I think the NFL is at least being like more transparent about it. Like we all kind of just assumed at some point the NFL would just say, screw it. They've been incredibly diligent about it the whole time, but they were also very much like the first league to take the next step because their season starts sooner, right? Like I just think that was always going to happen. I will say, not to get too like, I'm Mr. Political Reporter, I'm not, but the current CDC guidelines, if you look it up, which I just did before I logged on, they are to get a test after exposure, even if you don't have symptoms. So sports, pro leagues, policies are not in step with what the government is saying in this country. So blame them. Like that's just my thing. People blaming the Suns or making sort of an example out of the Suns was really confusing to me because they were taking advantage of the rules that were put in place. I also want to say a couple more things. So one is there's this idea that's forming that like this is some sort of excuse from the Suns. I think this is the opposite of that. The Suns very clearly don't want this coming out. It makes them look bad. They could get in trouble from the league. They might have broken rules. Why? Like people are like, this is pathetic or some sort of like running away from the reality of the Game 7 loss. It's like none of the players who've been asked about it publicly have made any gesture toward this, let alone admitted to it, because one, it would be bad on them. And number two, they're not going to take the bait of that type of excuse. They've made no attempt to make an excuse for it. Mikal Bridges was out here saying how embarrassing it was. This team's not making an excuse. The last thing on my end, and then I will hand it back to you if you have any last thoughts. As you can tell, I'm amped up. The Mercury at this time, we're in the middle of a big outbreak. I don't think people realize that. They share a practice facility with the Suns. This was the time, if it did cross anybody's memory, that Breanna Stewart was like basically a hostage in Phoenix because WNBA league rules would not allow her to travel once she had tested positive, which makes total sense, obviously, because they fly commercial. Multiple Storm players and staff were stuck in Phoenix after playing a game against the Mercury because they had tested positive. Multiple people within the Mercury organization at that time, players I'm talking about, I don't have inside info on any of this, players were having to sit out games at that time. I believe Skylar Diggins-Smith might have been one of them around this time. So the sharing of the facility, I don't know where it started and where it ended and who was patient zero here in this particular outbreak, but it all lines up. Lastly, I really hope that Suns PR did not know about this or anybody making like logistical decisions, because if they did, that to me is especially egregious. It's one thing for the competitive advantage stuff and like, let's have these players win. But we all, I think, have in the back of our heads that an idea of the possibilities for who the player might have been that tested positive. We don't even need to get into that today. But almost all of the key players on the team talked to the media before or during or after Game 7. So if people in the organization knew this was going on and went and had them talking to Al McCoy, talking to the room full of media, doing this and that during game day and leading up to game day, that's pretty bad. I really hope that that's not part of what happened and that it was a need-to-know basis sort of thing, because I mean, I guess it's not any different. Maybe I'm being selfish because I'm in the media than to have them all, up in the open at the arena. That's bad too. But the knowingness of it and like putting people in close proximity to other people would be pretty ugly. I don't know. I don't know if you have thoughts on any of that, Damon, but my rant is over.
Yeah, my last few thoughts are just kind of circling back to, none of the Suns tried to make excuse in any way. Mikal Bridges, when he went on the JJ Redick podcast, talked about, giving credit to Luka, credit to Brunson, Dinwiddie, even Finney-Smith, and then like Jason Kidd's adjustments. And, I think he's spot on with all of that. But then there are also these things going on behind the scenes. But, either way you look at it, the Suns just lost a bad series.
Yeah. Yeah. And people, I also don't think I personally don't think it's an excuse. Like, I'll say that too, right? It sounds like you think the same thing. Like, I don't think the team's making an excuse, and I also don't think it's one. They lost games 3 and 4 seemingly before any of this was a problem, if you follow the timeline that's in this article, right? It's like they should have handily taken this series if things went according to plan, right? Like they started to let the foot off the gas far before COVID ever seemed to become a part of this. We'll have more on this tomorrow with Aaron Edwards, I'm sure. Let's get into the draft stuff that Damon is here for. First, though, guys, a quick break to talk about Rock Auto. I've told you time and again that my search for a new car and then eventually buying a new car, my number one priority was to not have to buy parts or repair it or deal with any of that stuff because it sucks. It takes forever. You get nickel and dime. You kind of just have to throw caution to the wind and let somebody take your vehicle into their hands. It's a nightmare. Instead, what I would suggest doing, what we at the Locked On Podcast Network do, is use Rock Auto. Save time, save money, and you have more trust. A, because you're doing it yourself, and B, because they have what you need and you don't have to worry about that part. Rock Auto is a family business. They've been serving do-it-yourselfers online for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for every customer. They have everything that you might need. You basically just have to go to the website, type in the car that you have, scroll down to the part that you need, hit purchase, and it's at your door within days. That's literally all that it takes. So go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck, and write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, and all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, Damon, I appreciate you dealing with my fieriness in the last segment. People make me mad on the internet. I deleted the Twitter app from my phone, and yet I still got into it today with multiple people, but that's all right. Let me ask you this. The DeAndre Ayton trade stuff has in some part included draft picks. So we know the Suns have no picks in this draft. The Chris Paul deal, the Torrey Craig deal, it's all gone. Having a DeAndre Ayton sign and trade where the Suns got a pick in this year's draft doesn't line up on a timeline because the drafts before free agency, nothing can happen with Ayton until free agency because he's now going to become a free agent. Does that pass the smell test to you? Do you feel like we should be taking it seriously that the Suns could actually do something like that and sort of whisper into the opposing GM's ear who they'd like to pick and have all that? Like, does that seem realistic?
Yeah, so you're alluding to it. The buzzword here is tampering, and
yes.
That's what it would take for an 8 to result in a draft pick. And really keeping an eye on the way the Suns have gone about this whole thing. You know, they've interviewed guys that are probably going to go in the lottery. They've interviewed guys that are end of the first round, beginning of the second. They've worked out guys that are, probably going to be there for them undrafted if they want to go that route. So it's really kind of hard to figure out what's going on inside of James Jones's head.
Yeah.
To get back draft even without involving Ayton, but I think there are some really nice ones involving Ayton as well.
Yeah, we've heard from Gambo locally here that the Pacers are reportedly willing to part ways with the 6th pick. I'm not sure I fully understand why they would do that. In general, setting aside the tampering part of any of that, like the Pacers seem to be in a rebuild, although then you also see the Miles Turner stuff from Mark Stein today that was reported that they want to keep Miles Turner and they want to kind of get back to being competitive again, which makes sense. Indiana's terrified of losing any money. So I guess all that sort of lines up. Maybe they would be willing to part ways with the 6th pick. Either way, when you do start to think about it from a Suns standpoint, that seems like a lot to me. But regardless of whether it's an Ayton trade or something else, and we can get into some of those possibilities, this has the chance to become a 3rd straight draft where the Suns will have nothing to show for it. So, James Jones nailed the first 2 drafts that he was here. Since then, a little bit lacking. The team is getting older. So let's talk about how it could work for the Suns to get into this thing. But first, how much of a priority would you make it to get a pick if you were the Suns? Like, just thinking about the bigger picture of their roster and the types of players available in this year's draft, what we just saw in the playoffs, would it be something you would be trying to do to get back into the first round of this draft if you were James Jones?
Yeah, I think it depends on whether James has a guy that he sort of falls in love with, and that could be a guy like Tari Eason, who they've interviewed with already, whose range looks to be about 10 to 20-ish, though we know that James Jones has no shyness about taking a player ahead of projected range like Reese Johnson. So if they do end up with 6, maybe they do end up going with Eason. Really immediate, that's the Torrey Craig upgrade, frankly. And long term, it could be a little bit more than that. You know, he has these flashes of a really high ceiling, but it's about just finding the right kind of guy that fits both in the short term and the long term, I think.
So generally speaking, you wouldn't be wanting to get a pick just for the sake of like getting a young player on the roster. It's not like so important to you that you would sell out your other plans to prioritize like we need a rookie.
No, I don't think that would be smart business, James Jones. Just to go into there for the sake of getting it.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, like obviously I agree with that. I guess a better way to put it is like the idea of getting younger. This is obviously the best way to do that. I've been talking a lot since the playoffs ended about I think it's a pretty ideal thing to try to do in the course of the other business you're doing. I mean, understanding that the sign and trade thing with DeAndre Ayton is on the table or keeping him, that there's some of these other players who may or may not become available from the Suns. I'm not saying go do something insane, but I think it's important to get younger. And if you're going to add new players to this roster, to me, it makes the most sense to have them be on the younger end. Like, for instance, we're doing this mock draft thing on the Locked On Network for like the third or fourth straight year. I didn't participate because, again, the Suns don't have a pick, but I was around like in the chats and stuff as people were negotiating and thinking about trades and things like that. A player that caught my interest, who we kind of talked about, it didn't end up really materializing in anything because the trade just didn't make a lot of sense, was Cam Thomas from the Nets. Like, how much of a focus would it be if you were James Jones to just get younger?
You know, without waiting around is that I do really like that will probably after pick 50, because there are only 58 picks this year. I do think that there are more than 58 guys that, you know, could make a roster, I guess is the baseline way to put it. And there are going to be teams that take draft and stash in those 58 picks. And so, yeah, be able to get maybe the 50th player in the class. And that's really nothing to scoff at. I think that if James Jones was more willing to show an interest in undrafted guys, that it could have resulted in better things for the Suns and their development. You know, we've talked about like Austin Reeves a season ago was undrafted and available, and you know it seemed like there was just no interest at all in pursuing undrafted guys, and I think Austin Reeves could really at times during the season.
Yeah, that's something that I mean, I can't echo enough. I mean, I think that I have a note literally here in my prep for the show that says would love in all capitals to finally see the Suns' name come up in that sort of post-draft flurry of undrafted free agent signings. They don't even often get guaranteed contracts, but the Suns have just sat a lot of that stuff out completely. Not having a G League team really hurts in that area because it's hard to envision a path for development for those players when you're not sure if they're going to get playing time for you, if you're trying to chase a title and you don't have anywhere else for them to go. I think that is sort of the rock and the hard place that the Suns are sitting between right now when it comes to that stuff. But let's get a little bit more specific when it comes to trades here or targets of draft players, available rookies this year. First, quick word from Built Bar. The best tasting protein bar on the planet, and they've added another new product to their line. Who doesn't love a chewy, chocolatey brownie with caramel swirled on top? It might sound like an exaggeration when I describe that, and I try to say it's a protein bar. I get you're probably sitting there feeling like I'm exaggerating. I'm absolutely not exaggerating. The brownie Built Bars are some of my favorites already, between mint brownie and peanut butter brownie, which I literally just ordered a box of, the peanut butter brownie. It's perfect because already brownies are not super sweet. I don't like super sweet protein bars. That's why I love Built Bars. And the textures, it works. Caramel, just another perfect addition to the whole entire thing. The caramel brownie Built Bar, 130 calories, but packed with 17 grams of protein and only 4 grams of sugar. That's the best that you can do. Something good to put in your body that's going to taste good, but is not packed with unhealthy stuff. There are a million reasons to try Built Bars, but for now, let's just say that caramel brownie will rock your world. Not an understatement at all. With Built, tasty is the new health. So go to Built.com to get your box of caramel brownie bars now. And that's Built.com. Promo code LOCK15 when you make that order to get 15% off. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, Damon. So let me just ask you this. This question I had in mind as I was thinking about the idea of the Suns getting back into the draft generally. Is any player not named Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, or DeAndre Ayton worth a first-round pick? Like, is there anybody straight up who could be traded to get the Suns back into the first round if they wanted to? That's not on that list.
Not a chance. Not a chance.
Yeah.
There's just zero chance without compounding contract. Maybe, throwing a thing, but not straight up.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Jay Crowder is the closest,
or at least
that
not
you probably
to get
would
back
get.
in the first round.
Yeah. I think I agree with you completely. With that said, then, is there any type of trade structure that you've thought about that makes sense for the Suns to stack a couple players together, get into a multi-team trade? Like, is there something, not including DeAndre Ayton, that you could envision them getting back into the first round with, like Crowder plus Cameron Payne or Crowder plus Landry Shamet? What makes the most sense to you?
Thinking about it now, I think that Payne and Crowder plus like a future second or something to get into the 20 to 25-ish range is something that I think is realistic, just because of the fact that like those are pretty workable contracts as far as guaranteed money goes. I think campaign just has like 2 men after this season. Other than that, there's pretty much just hiring between those two. And I think there are guys in that range that you could get that would help fill. In that specific guy like Andrew Nembhard from Gonzaga, who I consider to be one of the better like floor general prospects in the class. And he had a great showing at the Combine. I think it was like 30-10 or something like that. And just playing behind Chris Paul would be super beneficial to his development, I think.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to ask. I think I tend to agree with you. It's kind of hard right now until we hear anything more concrete to imagine what a trade could look like. I do think Crowder is close to being worth that. I know he's on an expiring contract, but I think we've kind of swung back around a little bit to players, veteran players who don't have a lot of time on their contract being worth a little bit more, especially in like that 20 to 30 range in the first round. So, if you were putting Crowder with something else, like you said, a future second, I mean, maybe Payne, I think you're getting there. I also feel like not a first, but the idea of getting like the Suns trading Aaron Holiday's rights, the restricted free agency status that he has, to another team on draft night for like a second round pick wouldn't shock me. That seems possible. But that was the other thing I was going to ask you. in terms of like where this draft is strongest and what you think the Suns need, what types of players could you envision the Suns targeting? And you've been paying closer attention to the interviews that they've had and like the guys that they've brought in too. So what position groups or sort of archetypes are the Suns kind of would they be in the mix for if they did get back in?
There are a lot of really good roller type of guys, especially in the second round and in the back end of the first round, which, obviously you're not going to find a star in those ranges in any draft, barring like getting Jokic 40 pick, but just guys that can do like a solid one or two things really well, but don't have that refined all-around game that would give them a lottery grade. Guys like Nembhard and EJ, who the Suns have already talked to as well, who can just play a role on any team really if they're given the right development context and leash. I think EJ Liddell could play minutes on this team. Andrew Nembhard could play minutes on this team. There are different guys like that throughout the second round as well, and it's just finding the right skill, because really a lot of those guys are just one or two, finding the right skill and developing them in the right context.
If I were to just ask you in sort of, the outside the lottery types of players, if James Jones' mission, I'm not saying it is this, but if he just said, I have a chance to get a pick, my number one goal is I want to find a player who can contribute in his rookie season next year while we still are trying to win a title, who is the first name that comes to your mind?
This is a little past just outside the lottery, but
yeah, I'm just saying any point from the lottery on. So
talked a lot about.
Sorry, who is it?
Yeah, Keon Ellis from Alabama. He's like 6'5" with a 6'9" wingspan, super skinny, only like 170 pounds, but he really harasses the point of it and can shoot the three pretty well. He's an older player, which we know James Jones likes. I think he's got like 5 years of college ball under his belt. So a guy like that and I think The Athletic and ESPN both have him outside their top 60. So you could probably get after the draft, be someone that could come in and be the Alvarado role, so to speak, of just pounding the ball and hitting a shot now and then.
So it doesn't sound like you think. Is there is it Nembhard? Is that sort of like the first round guy who would be able to maybe come in and be in a playoff rotation right away, or does this draft not have a lot of those guys? I know that's a big ask. There's only a couple of them every year, but if you were guessing who that ends up being from this draft, who's not in the lottery, the Desmond Bane of this year, or the Tyrese Maxey, he's not a great example because he was a highly ranked prospect coming into college. The Xavier Tillman, there's always a few of those guys. Are there any that strike you that way in this year's draft?
Jalen Williams, actually, from Santa Clara, is a really solid scorer. He's actually from the Valley, graduated from Paris, and has a brother there now that's a top 30 recruit. He's really, really good as a scorer. 6'8", 210-ish, I think. And he just knows how to get to his spots and create his own buckets, really from a variety of angles and variety of areas on the court. But he doesn't do all that much else. So that'd be the type of thing where it's like a TJ Warren-esque kind of role, just a little more willing to step outside of the mid-range. Jalen Williams is for me. Jake is another one that a lot of people like. He's a role that will defend really hard and can do for you offensively, but not a ton. Guys that just can play minutes in a playoff rotation that really can just survive out there without being horrendous mistakes or traffic cones or pigeons, as the Suns like to call them. You know, guys like that. Those are the two that stick out most to me.
Awesome. I think we'll definitely have Damon on if the Suns get another pick. We might have to do it even if they don't, just as we get closer, more workouts get reported. We just kind of get a better sense of where this draft is headed. I mean, we all know James Jones keeps us on our heels. I didn't exactly expect the Landry Shamet thing last year. None of us expected the Jalen Smith or the Cam Johnson picks. So you never quite know what he's up to. I do think, like you said, Damon, the fact that they are doing seemingly a fair bit of intel gathering and due diligence in terms of these interviews and workouts makes it seem like they're not just like sitting this out. I mean, obviously that's what a smart front office should do, but I agree. Like, we're probably smart to sort of have our eyes wide a little bit, watching what's going on, because it wouldn't be crazy if they pulled something off where they did get back in, even if it was the second round or something like that. So we will keep our eyes on the draft. Again, 2 weeks away. Tomorrow, Aaron Edwards back talking. I don't even know. I might just give him the floor and say, what's been going on that you want to talk about? Because this team gives us no shortage of nonsense to sift through. That'll be it for today. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen today and every day. Now go make Locked On NBA Big Board your second listen to keep up with all things draft.